My mother sold me for the price of a bad harvest and a cask of sour wine. Not a grand debt, you understand. Just a tired one. So I was traded to the silent lord of the north, Valerius, whose fortress was said to have ice in its very bones. My role was simple: keeper of the apiaries. It was a life of quiet buzzing, the scent of wax and honey, and the blessed solitude that suited a girl with nothing left to her name but her own thoughts. My world was small, bordered by the hives and the herb gardens, and I liked it that way. It was a life lived on the margins, unseen and unheard, which was the safest place for someone like me to be. The wind that scoured the fortress walls was my only regular visitor, a thief that stole the warmth from my cloak but never managed to touch the small, stubborn heat I kept inside. The decree arrived on a day when that same wind had teeth. It was read in the lower courtyard by a steward whose lips were blue with cold, the parchment crackling like fire. Henceforth, by order of Lord Valerius, all surplus honey from the hives was to be rendered unto the kitchens for the creation of a spiced mead, a celebratory draught for the impending arrival of Lady Seraphina of the Glass Peaks. My honey, my surplus. The small treasure I bartered for winter wool and new boots, the sweet currency of my small life, was to be confiscated for a party I would not be attending, for a woman I would never meet. The injustice of it was so grand, so utterly, predictably unfair, that a laugh escaped me. It wasn't a giggle. It was a raw, sharp bark of sound that cut through the respectful silence of the other servants. It was the most foolish thing I had ever done. Every head turned. The steward froze, his mouth a perfect O of outrage, and up on the battlements, half hidden in the shadow of a stone gargoyle, a figure went still. I knew, even from that distance, who it was. Lord Valerius, the frozen king. He never attended these public pronouncements, yet there he was. He was a man made of winter's silence, a figure of legend more than flesh. I had only ever seen him as a distant shape, a hard line against the sky. But I felt his gaze then, a physical weight, like a sudden drop in temperature. He had heard me. He had seen me. And in the cold, listening silence of that courtyard, I knew my quiet, marginal life had just ended. The laughter died in my throat, leaving behind the bitter taste of ash. I had made a sound, and in the silent Lord's fortress, that was a mistake you only made once. That night, something scratched at my door. It wasn't the wind. This was a deliberate, rhythmic sound, the scrape of a claw on old wood. My cottage was small, perched on the edge of the fortress grounds, where the wild woods began to press in. Fear was a cold hand on my heart, but curiosity was a sharper spur. I unlatched the door a crack and peered out into the moon-drenched dark. There, on my doorstep, sat a wolf. But this was no ordinary wolf. It was a creature of impossible size, its fur the color of storm clouds, its shoulders as broad as a man's. Its eyes were not the gold of a wild thing, but a startling, intelligent silver gray, the exact color of the winter sky over the fortress. They watched me with an unnerving focus. It held something in its jaws. With a dip of its massive head, it gently deposited its offering on my stoop, then turned and vanished back into the trees, silent as a shadow. The gift was a raven, its feathers a slick, oily black in the moonlight. It was perfectly intact, its neck broken with a clean, merciful snap. Tucked under its wing was a small, milky quartz stone, smooth and cool to the touch. It was a bizarre, macabre, and strangely formal presentation. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bare feet, my mind racing. No ordinary wolf behaved this way. And those eyes, I knew those eyes. I had felt them on me just that afternoon from the battlements. A cold dread, mingled with a bewildering sense of wonder, settled over me. I disposed of the poor raven, but I kept the stone, its smooth surface a strange comfort in my pocket. The silence that followed was different now, heavier. It felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath. The next morning, Lord Valerius himself stood where the wolf had been. I opened my door to find him there, and the shock of it nearly sent me stumbling backward. Up close, he was even more imposing. He was built like the stone of his fortress, all hard lines and severe angles, his face a closed ledger. His silver-gray eyes, the same as the wolf's, were fixed on a loose floorboard just past my shoulder, refusing to meet mine. The silence between us was immense, a chasm. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like rock grinding against rock. There was a disturbance, he said, his voice a low rasp, unused and stiff. Last night, near your dwelling. He seemed to be wrestling with the words, forcing them out against their will. It will not happen again. He was beautiful, I realized with a jolt, but in the way a blade is beautiful, all sharp edges and cold, dangerous purpose. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, his stillness not one of command, but of excruciating restraint. His gaze flickered to my hand, which was worrying the quartz stone in my apron pocket. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "My hound," he said, the word sounding foreign and false on his tongue. "He is overzealous. His instincts are strong." This was an apology. The Lord of the North, the frozen king, was standing on my doorstep, apologizing for his dog. It was the single most absurd thing that had ever happened to me. And I, the girl who had laughed at his decree, found myself unable to speak. I simply nodded. He gave a stiff, jerky nod in return, turned on his heel and strode away without another word. The air he left behind crackled with unspoken things, with the immense effort of his presence, and I was left with the chilling, impossible certainty that Lord Valerius and the great wolf were one and the same. And for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, his instincts were focused entirely on me. The summons came the following day. I was not to be punished for my laughter, nor for attracting the Lord's hound. I was to be relocated. A small, unused chamber in the West Tower was now mine. The official reason, delivered by the same blue-lipped steward, was that the rooftop apiaries required a dedicated keeper in closer proximity, and that a recent blight affecting hives in the south required urgent study. I was granted access to the Lord's personal library to conduct my research. It was a flimsy pretext, and we both knew it. I was being brought inside the stone walls, directly into the heart of his silence. My new room was cold, the stone weeping with a perpetual dampness, but the window looked out over the sprawling gray-green forest. It was a cage, but a cage with a view. The library became my sanctuary and my prison. It was a vast, circular room, 2 stories high, with shelves that groaned under the weight of centuries. The air smelled of old parchment, leather, and wood smoke from the massive hearth that was always lit, but never seemed to give off enough heat. It was his space. I felt it the moment I walked in. The silence in here was different. It was his silence, curated and profound. And he was always there, He would sit in a high-backed chair by the fire, a heavy tome open on his lap. But I never saw him turn a page. He was just there, still as the carved gargoyles on the walls, watching. Not me, not directly. He watched the fire, or the shadows, or a space just to the left of my head. But I felt the weight of his attention, a constant low-level pressure on my skin. Our days fell into a strange, silent rhythm. I would search the shelves for ancient texts on apiculture, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. He would sit, still and silent, a monolith in the corner. We never spoke. The air was thick with things unsaid, a tension that was as palpable as the cold. Sometimes, I would find a book left on the table where I worked, a history of the region or a collection of poetry, opened to a specific page. There was never a note, never a word, just the silent offering. I would read it, and the next day it would be gone, replaced by another. It was a conversation without voices, a courtship conducted through the rustle of turning pages. I learned about him in those books. I saw the passages he had underlined, notes scribbled in a severe, sharp hand in the margins, observations on honor, duty, and a profound, aching loneliness that seemed to bleed from the ink. One evening, driven by a rare bout of courage, I left a small pot of my own honey on the table next to his chair, with a single, perfect lavender sprig tucked beside it. The next morning, it was gone. He said nothing. He did not look at me. But as he sat by the fire, I saw the empty pot on the mantelpiece behind him. It was the smallest of acknowledgments, but it felt like a seismic shift. That afternoon, as I was reaching for a book on a high shelf, my fingers slipped. The heavy volume tumbled, and I braced for it to hit the floor. Instead, a hand shot out and caught it, inches from my head. It was his. He had moved from his chair so quickly, so silently, I hadn't even registered it. He stood over me, the book in his hand, his proximity a sudden, shocking wave of warmth. I could smell the ozone scent of cold air that clung to him, mixed with something else. Wood smoke and wild, clean earth. "Be careful," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt in my bones. His silver eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and in their depths, I saw not a king, but a man trapped behind a wall of ice, looking out. He placed the book in my hands, our fingers brushing for a scant moment. The touch was electric, a spark of heat in the frozen silence of the library, and in that instant, I knew I was in more danger than I had ever been. If you're finding a home in this story, and you want to keep your seat by the fire for more tales like this one, take a moment to hit that like button. It lets me know you're out there, listening in the dark. Lady Seraphina arrived like a shard of ice, beautiful and sharp, and designed to draw blood. She swept into the fortress with a retinue of servants and a mountain of baggage, filling the cold halls with her high, brittle laughter and the scent of expensive, cloying perfume. She was everything I was not. Tall, exquisitely dressed, her hair the color of spun gold, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. She was the woman for whom my honey had been confiscated, the intended bride meant to seal a political alliance and warm the frozen king's bed. The fortress, which had begun to feel like a shared space between myself and its lord, suddenly felt alien and hostile again. She owned it, her every glance and gesture declaring her rightful place. She found me in the library, of course. It was the one place I thought was safe, my quiet domain of parchment and dust. She glided in, her silk gown whispering over the stone floor, her ladies-in-waiting trailing her like nervous little birds. She stopped before my table, piled high with books on bee husbandry, and looked down at me with an expression of mild disgust, as if she'd found a grub in her salad. "So, this is the Lord's new pet," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "The little bee sting he's taken such an interest in. Tell me, do you buzz when you speak?" Her ladies tittered behind their hands. I felt the hot flush of shame creep up my neck, but I refused to look away from her cold blue eyes. I had survived my mother's casual cruelty and a life of being overlooked. I would not be broken by the shallow malice of a pampered noblewoman. "Only when provoked, my lady," I said, my voice quiet but clear. Her smile tightened, the sweetness curdling. "Insolence. I suppose that's what he finds so charming. Men of his station are often amused by the antics of common things. But remember your place, little creature. You are here on his sufferance, a whim. And whims, like seasons, change." She reached out a slender, gloved hand and flicked one of my books, sending it sliding across the table. "When I am lady of this fortress, I will have this dusty room cleared out. It will make a fine sitting room." Just as the threat settled in the air between us, a deeper silence fell over the room. Lord Valerius stood in the arched doorway, his presence sucking all the air and warmth from the space. He had not been there a moment before. He moved with the same unnerving quiet as the wolf. Lady Seraphina's expression immediately shifted, melting into a dazzling smile. "Valerius, darling, I was just getting acquainted with your librarian." He did not look at her. His silver gaze swept over the room, over her, and settled on me. There was no warmth in it, no overt sign of favor, but it was a deliberate, focused attention that excluded everyone else. He walked not to her, but to my table. He picked up the book she had pushed aside, his large, scarred hand gentle on the worn leather cover. "Mistress Ilara," he said, and the use of a formal, respectful title made Seraphina's back go rigid. "You were researching the pallid blight. Did you find the reference in the agrarian histories of the First Kingdom?" His voice was its usual low monotone, but the question was a shield. It was a public declaration of my purpose, my value. He was not defending me from Seraphina's insult. He was elevating me above it, placing us in a conversation she could not enter. I looked from his severe face to Seraphina's, which was now a mask of fury. "I did, my lord," I replied, my voice steady. "It seems the cure lies not in herbs, but in the soil itself." He gave a single curt nod. "As I suspected. Continue your work." He turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving Lady Seraphina standing in a silence that was far more humiliating than any shouted rebuke. She had been dismissed, and I had been seen. The attack, when it came, was not against me, but against the one thing I truly loved. I went to the rooftop hives one morning to find a scene of silent devastation. A strange, acrid smell hung in the air, a chemical bitterness that clung to the back of my throat. My bees, my beautiful, industrious bees, were dead. Thousands of them lay in dark, still piles at the entrances to their hives. They had not been overcome by disease. They had been poisoned. A deep, cold rage, unlike anything I had ever felt, settled in my chest. This was Seraphina's work. It was a message sent with her signature cruelty. She could destroy what I cared for without ever laying a hand on me. My grief was a hard, tight knot in my stomach, but tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. Crying would make me a victim. I needed to be a threat. I did not run to the steward. I did not raise an alarm among the servants. I knelt among the dead and carefully, deliberately, selected a single bee. I cupped it in my palm, its small, fuzzy body inert and lifeless, and I walked away from the quiet hives. I walked through the kitchens, where the cook, Martha, saw my face and made a small sign against evil. I walked through the lower courtyard, past guards who stared at my grim procession of one. I walked straight into the great hall, where Lord Valerius was holding council with his senior commanders, and of course, Lady Seraphina, who was draped elegantly over a chair at his side. The hall was full of powerful men, their voices echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. My entrance brought a sudden, jarring halt to their conversation. Every eye turned to me, a small, soot-stained woman in a plain wool dress, interrupting the governance of the North. I walked directly to the high table, my worn boots making no sound on the stone flags. I ignored the gasps, the mutters, the sheer audacity of my own actions. My focus was entirely on him. Lord Valerius watched my approach, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes, those piercing silver eyes, burned with a terrifying intensity. A low growl rumbled in the room, so deep it seemed to come from the stones themselves, and I knew it was his. The wolf was just beneath the surface, straining at the leash of his control. I stopped before him, opened my hand, and presented the dead bee on my palm. "My bees have been poisoned, my lord," I said, my voice shaking not with fear, but with the force of my fury. "This is a gift from your honored guest." I did not look at Seraphina, but I felt her go rigid with shock and outrage. I had not accused her in private. I had brought her crime into the light, into the center of his power, and laid it at his feet for all to see. I had given him no choice. He had to act. His gaze dropped to the bee in my hand, then rose to meet mine. In his eyes, I saw the ice crack. I saw the flash of a predator that had just seen its mate threatened. The bond between us, forged in silence and stolen books, was about to be tested in fire and blood. The tribunal was a formal affair, convened in the great hall that same evening. The entire household was assembled, from the highest-ranking commander to the lowliest stable hand. Torches burned in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stone gargoyles seem to writhe and sneer. It was a stage, and I was to be one of the lead players in a drama I had not written. I stood alone in the center of the floor, while Lady Seraphina sat near the dais, flanked by her own guards, the picture of aggrieved innocence. Lord Valerius sat on his high-backed throne, his face carved from shadow and granite. The only person who met my eye was Gideon, his second in command, who stood near the throne and gave me a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. It was a small comfort, but I clung to it. I presented my case simply, without embellishment or tears. I described the state of the hives, the particular smell in the air, and the swiftness of the poison. I spoke of my life's work, the quiet joy the bees had given me, and how that had been stolen away. I laid the dead bee on the stone floor before the throne, a tiny, silent testament to a great crime. When I was finished, a heavy silence filled the hall. Then Seraphina spoke, her voice ringing with theatrical disbelief. "This is an outrage, the ravings of a jealous servant. She is a commoner, a nobody, who has somehow deluded herself into thinking she holds the Lord's favor. She likely killed the wretched insects herself to gain attention." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Does this hall truly have nothing better to do than listen to the fantasies of a kennel girl who got lucky?" Her arrogance was her undoing. She was so certain of her station, so sure of my insignificance, that she overplayed her hand. Valerius raised a hand, silencing her. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously soft, the quiet rumble before an avalanche. "You seem very certain it was poison, my lady. The master of the guard suggested it could have been a natural blight." Serafina waved a dismissive hand. "A fatal mistake." "A blight? Don't be absurd. A blight is slow, messy. Only a potent tincture of nightshade root, distilled in oil of winter vetch, could act so quickly and leave such a distinct smell. It is a poison known only in the glass peaks, I assure you." She smiled, proud of her knowledge. A collective gasp went through the hall. In her haste to sound superior, to dismiss any other possibility, she had named the specific, rare poison and its origin. Details only the architect of the crime could possibly know. She had signed her own confession in the open court. The smile froze on her face as she realized what she had done. The silence that followed was absolute, a stone-cold verdict. Lord Valerius rose from his throne. He did not look at Serafina, whose face had crumpled into a mask of horrified disbelief. He descended the steps of the dais, his movements deliberate and final. He walked past her, past his commanders, past the entire assembled court, until he stood directly in front of me. The frozen king, the silent lord of the north, a man who had never shown deference to anyone, stopped before the beekeeper in her soot-stained dress. He looked down at the dead bee on the floor between us. Then his gaze rose to meet mine. And then, in an act that shattered 1,000 years of protocol and stunned the entire hall into breathless silence, he knelt. He went down on one knee before me, his head bowed. "The fault is mine, Mistress Ilara," he said, his voice raw and clear for all to hear. "I brought this venom into my house and allowed it to harm what was under my protection. I have failed you. I beg your forgiveness." He took my calloused, honey-stained hand in his touch no longer a fleeting spark, but a firm, possessive warmth. He had not only rejected the antagonist, he had publicly declared his allegiance, his vulnerability, and his heart. He had chosen me, and in kneeling, had raised me higher than any queen. Lady Serafina was exiled before sunrise, sent back to the glass peaks in disgrace, her grand ambitions reduced to ash. The political fallout was, I was told, considerable, but Valerius handled it with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything. A silence descended on the fortress once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. The oppressive, cold weight was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt like peace, like the comfortable stillness between two people who no longer need words. The fortress itself seemed to breathe easier. The constant biting wind that scoured the walls seemed to soften, and for the first time since my arrival, I saw the pale northern sun manage to cast a watery golden light into the courtyard. Our new normal was found in the library. It was still our sanctuary, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. He no longer sat apart from me, a stone sentinel by the fire. He now sat at the table with me, sometimes reading his own tomes, sometimes just watching me work. A small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips when I would mutter to myself in frustration over a difficult text. The chasm between us had been bridged. The first time he truly spoke to me, not as a lord or a king, but as a man, was a week after the tribunal. He pushed a book across the table to me, its leather cover worn smooth with age. It was a treatise on the construction of winter-safe apiaries. "We will rebuild them," he said, his voice still low, but without the rocky hitch of disuse. "Together, better than before." It was a promise not just about the bees, but about everything, about us. One evening, as a soft snow began to fall outside the tall, arched windows, he came to stand behind my chair. I could feel his warmth, a living heat that the great hearth could never replicate. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch gentle but firm, a grounding weight. I leaned back into it, a gesture of trust I wouldn't have thought myself capable of just months before. "Do you remember the first night?" he murmured, his breath stirring my hair. "In the woods?" I nodded, my heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. "I don't control him," he confessed, the admission costing him a visible effort. "The wolf, he is my instinct, my heart, when my mind is too frozen by duty to feel. He knew you from the very beginning. He saw you laugh in the courtyard, and he knew you were the only real thing in this entire fortress of stone." He paused. "It has taken the man a great deal longer to catch up." I turned in my chair to face him, and for the first time, I raised my hand and traced the hard line of his jaw. He did not flinch. He closed his eyes and leaned into my touch, a silent surrender that spoke more than 1,000 declarations of love. The spring that followed was unlike any the North had seen in a century. As we rebuilt the hives on the roof, a riot of wildflowers began to bloom in the fortress gardens, which had been barren and frostbitten for as long as anyone could remember. The bees, my new colonies, thrived. The entire keep seemed to thaw from the inside out. The stone felt warmer to the touch, the halls were brighter, and the servants, who once walked with their shoulders hunched against the cold and their lord's moods, now smiled and spoke in quiet, cheerful tones. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the garden watching the bees, Gideon approached with a crate. In it was the first bottling of the new season's mead. Not the spiced, cloying drink meant for Seraphina, but a simple, golden mead made from my honey. Valerius poured 2 cups. He handed one to me and raised his own. "To the keeper of the apiaries," he said, his silver eyes crinkling at the corners, "who reminded a king of stone that he had a heart." We drank, and the mead was sweet, tasting of sunshine and lavender, and the promise of a life no longer lived on the margins, but at the very center of a world reborn. The small, stubborn heat I had kept hidden inside me for so long had finally found its hearth. It was home. My name is Alara, and this was my story. The journey from an unseen girl, traded for a pittance, to the woman for whom the frozen king knelt, was not one I ever expected to make. It was a path paved with injustice, fear, and the quiet courage to speak when silence was demanded. But it led me here, to a warmth I never knew existed, and to a love as fierce and untamed as a northern wolf. It ends here, for now, in the sunlight, with the buzzing of bees and the steady presence of a man who learned to feel again. So tell me, as you sit there listening, where are you in the world tonight? What corner of this globe are you in, sharing this moment with me? I love to imagine all the different places these stories reach, a web of listeners connected by a single tale told into the darkness. Let me know in the comments below. And what about you? What was the moment in this story that truly caught you? Was it the laughter in the courtyard? The wolf's strange gift? Or the moment he knelt in the great hall? I want to know what resonated with you the most. Tell me one thing in the comments below before you go. If you want to keep your seat here by my fire, to hear more stories of hearts that thaw and courage that blazes in the darkest of places, then be sure to subscribe. There are always more tales waiting to be told. And remember, even in the coldest of fortresses, a single spark of defiance can be enough to start a fire that warms the world.